David noticed the space first. Not the physical space, though that had grown too, but the quiet one. The kind that settles between two people who still share a bed yet live separate inner lives. Emma lay beside him, facing away, her breathing steady and predictable. He stared at the ceiling, counting cracks in the paint, wondering when he'd stopped reaching for her in the dark. It hadn't always been like this. Once, her presence felt like gravity. Even silence with her had weight and meaning. Now silence felt like absence. He replayed the last time he'd tried. Not dramatically. Just a hand on her waist. It was a familiar touch. She'd stiffened almost imperceptibly, then whispered, "Not tonight, okay, babe?" He'd said that word more times than he could count. David told himself it was normal. Stress, life, seasons change. But something inside him began folding inward, like a plant deprived of light. He stopped asking. Not because he didn't want her, but because hope had started to hurt. Emma sensed the distance but misunderstood it. She thought he was tired, or busy, or growing older in ways that marriages quietly accept. She didn't realize that each refusal had chipped away at something fragile in him. That night, lying inches apart, they were both awake, but neither spoke. And neither knew how long this silence had already been living with them. Emma wasn't avoiding David. At least, that's what she told herself. She still loved him. Still appreciated the way he fixed things without being asked. Still smiled when he laughed. But intimacy had begun to feel heavy, demanding. She no longer spoke it fluently. Some nights, when David rolled toward her, her chest tightened. It wasn't fear. It was simply an exhaustion she couldn't explain. It felt easier to turn away than to confront the confusion rising in her body. She hated herself for it. She remembered when desire felt effortless. When touch brought comfort instead of pressure. But lately, her mind felt foggy, her emotions dull. She moved through days on autopilot, smiling when expected, functioning well enough that no one worried. Not even David. Especially not David. She assumed he understood. He always had. So when he stopped initiating, relief mixed with unease. Relief because the pressure lifted. Unease because something important seemed to disappear with it. One evening she caught him watching her. Not with desire, but with something quieter. Quieter. "What?" she asked lightly. "Nothing," he replied too quickly. She felt a strange pang. Not guilt. Something closer to loss. That night, she lay awake, wondering when intimacy had started to feel like something she needed to avoid instead of something she needed. She didn't yet have language for what was happening inside her. David didn't withdraw out of anger. He withdrew out of dignity. Each refusal had felt like a small erasure. Not of desire, but of worth. He questioned himself in ways he never had before. Was he unattractive? Inconvenient? A burden she tolerated rather than chose. So he adapted. He focused on work. Stayed up later. Left earlier. Learned to redirect longing into productivity. Into silence. He told himself it was noble. Respectful. After all, no one should pressure the person they love. But beneath that reasoning lived something more fragile. Self-protection. Hope once wounded becomes dangerous. Emma noticed the change slowly. He laughed less. Much less. Even his presence felt different. As though he were only partially there. She mistook his withdrawal for indifference. And that misunderstanding became another brick in the wall growing between them. One night, she reached for him impulsively. He stiffened, just slightly, but enough for her to notice. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm fine," he said. But the truth was heavier. He wasn't fine. He was grieving something he couldn't name. The argument didn't explode. Leaked out slowly. "You don't touch me anymore," Emma said one evening, not accusing, confused. David stared at his plate. The question felt unfair, even cruel, though she hadn't intended it that way. "How long has it been?" he asked quietly. "Since when?" "Since you last wanted me." The silence that followed was heavier than any raised voice. Emma searched her memory and froze. Weeks. Months. She realized she couldn't remember. The realization terrified her. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered. "I know," he replied. "That's the hardest part." She began to cry, not because she felt blamed, but because she saw the damage clearly for the first time. The distance hadn't appeared overnight. It had been growing quietly, unchecked. And neither of them had spoken its name. The truth surfaced unexpectedly. Doctor's office. Routine visit. Emma hadn't given honest answers to questions in months. "Do you feel joy?" the doctor asked. Emma hesitated. That hesitation said everything. Depression doesn't always arrive as sadness. Occasionally it comes as numbness. Disconnection. There is a subtle depletion of desire, whether it be for anything or anything in particular. Suddenly the fog made sense. The exhaustion. The avoidance. It wasn't David she'd been rejecting. It was she. She went home shaking, unsure how to explain this without sounding broken. David listened in silence as she spoke haltingly about the diagnosis, the numbness, the shame. For the first time in months, his withdrawal cracked. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "I didn't know how," she said. "I didn't know what was wrong." He reached for her hand, not out of desire but care. And that felt like a beginning. Emma's confession explained everything, and changed nothing. David felt compassion, relief, but also grief. Understanding didn't erase the months of loneliness. It didn't restore the confidence he'd lost or the walls he'd built to survive. He admitted something he'd never said aloud. "I learned how not to need you." The words scared them both. He hadn't meant to punish her. But distance had become safer than hope. He wasn't sure how to undo that. Emma realized healing wouldn't be instant. Love didn't simply snap back into place because explanations existed. They were standing at the edge of something fragile. Together but uncertain. They started therapy. Not to fix sex but to rebuild safety. They learned how often they'd spoken past each other. How silence had done more damage than any argument. How both had been protecting themselves in ways that unintentionally harmed the other. Progress was uneven. Some days felt hopeful, others raw. But slowly touch returned, not as expectation but as choice. A hand held. A shoulder leans in. They learned intimacy wasn't just physical, it was emotional risk. And risk takes time. One night, Emma reached for David again. This time he hesitated. The pause shattered her confidence. She pulled back instantly, panic rising. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have." He stopped her. "This is what healing looks like," he said gently. Awkward. Teary. Slow. They stayed awake talking until dawn. Fear didn't disappear. But it no longer ruled. Months passed. Some things improved. Others lingered. But something essential had changed. They were no longer silent. Emma continued treatment. David learned how to want without disappearing into shame. They argued sometimes, but they talked. Healing wasn't a moment. It was practice. And some days choosing each other still felt like work. But it felt worth it. They still share the same bed. But now silence feels different. It isn't absence. It's rest. David reaches for Emma. Not out of need but presence. Emma turns toward him, not out of obligation but trust. They don't pretend the past didn't hurt. They honor it by not repeating it. Their marriage wasn't saved by desire alone, but by courage, communication, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. Healing, they learned, is not an ending. It's a way of living,